Now, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman in Chicago with our next guest. Juan Gonzalez is in New York.
Well, next weekend, the United States celebrates the 4th of July, the day the American colonies declared their independence from England in 1776. While many Americans will hang flags, participate in parades, and watch fireworks, Independence Day is not a cause for celebration for all. For Native Americans, it is yet another bitter reminder of colonialism, which brought fatal diseases, cultural hegemony, and full-out genocide. Neither did the new republic's promise of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness extend to African Americans. As our next guest notes, the white colonists who declared their freedom from the crown did not share their newly founded liberation with the millions of Africans they had captured and forced into slavery.
Professor Gerald Horne argues that the so-called Revolutionary War was actually a counter-revolution in part, not a progressive step forward for humanity, but a conservative effort by American colonialists to protect their system of slavery. For more, Professor Horne joins us here in our Chicago studio. He's the author of two new books, The Counter-Revolution of 1776, Slave Resistance and the Origins of the United States of America, and another new book just out, Race to Revolution, the U.S. and Cuba During Slavery and Jim Crow. Professor Horne teaches history and African-American studies at the University of Houston. Welcome to Democracy Now! It's great to have you with us. So as we move into this Independence Day week, what should we understand about the founding of the United States?
We should understand that July 4th, 1776, in many ways represents a counter-revolution. That is to say that what helped to prompt July 4th, 1776 was the perception amongst European settlers on the North American mainland that London was moving rapidly towards abolition. This perception was prompted by Somerset's case, a case decided in London in June 1772, which seemed to suggest that abolition, which not only was going to be ratified in London itself, was going to cross the Atlantic and basically sweep through the mainland, thereby jeopardizing numerous fortunes, not only based upon slavery, but the slave trade. That's the short answer. The longer answer would involve going back to another revolution, that is to say the so-called Glorious Revolution in England in 1688, which among other things involved a step back from the monarch, the king, and a step forward for the rising merchant class. This led to a deregulation of the African slave trade, that is to say the Royal African Company theretofore had been in control of the slave trade, but with the rising power of the merchant class, this slave trade was deregulated, leading to what I call free trade in Africans. That is to say, merchants then descended upon the African continent, manacling and handcuffing every African in sight with the energy of demented and crazed bees, dragging them across the Atlantic, particularly to the Caribbean and to the North American mainland. This was prompted by the fact that the profits for the slave trade were tremendous, sometimes up to 1,600 or 1,700%. And as you know, there are those even today who will sell their firstborn for such a profit. This, on the one hand, helped to boost the productive forces, both in the Caribbean and on the mainland, but it led to numerous slave revolts, not least in the Caribbean, but also on the mainland, which helped to give the mainlanders second thoughts about London's tentative steps towards abolition.
Gerald Horne, one of the things that struck me in your book is not only your main thesis that this was, in large part, a counter-revolution, the United States War of Independence, but you also link very closely what was going on in the Caribbean colonies of England as well as in the United States, not only in terms of among the slaves in both areas, but also among the white population. And in fact, you indicate that quite a few of those who ended up here in the United States fostering the American Revolution had actually been refugees from the battles between whites and slaves in the Caribbean. Could you expound on that?
It's well known that up into the middle part of the 18th century, London felt that the Caribbean colonies, Jamaica, Barbados, Antigua in particular, were in some ways more valuable than the mainland colonies. The problem was that in the Caribbean colonies, the Africans outnumbered the European settlers, sometimes at a rate of 20 to 1, which facilitated slave revolts. There were major slave revolts in Antigua, for example, in 1709 and 1736. The Maroons, that is to say the Africans who had escaped London's jurisdiction in Jamaica, had challenged the crown quite sternly. This led, as your question suggests, to many European settlers in the Caribbean making the great trek to the mainland, being chased out of the Caribbean by enraged Africans. For example, I did research for this book in Newport, Rhode Island, and the main library there to this very day is named after Abraham Redwood, who fled Antigua after the 1736 slave revolt, because many of his, quote, Africans, unquote, were involved in this slave revolt. And he fled in fear and established the main library in Newport to this very day and helped to basically establish that city on the Atlantic coast. So there is a close connection between what was transpiring in the Caribbean and what was taking place on the mainland. And historians need to recognize that even though these colonies were not necessarily a unitary project, there were close and intimate connections between and amongst them.
So why this great disparity between how people in the United States talk about the creation myth of the United States, if you will? I'm not talking about indigenous people, Native American people, and this story that you have researched.
Well, it is fair to say that the United States did provide a sanctuary for Europeans. Indeed, I think part of the, quote, genius, unquote, of the U.S. project, if there was such a genius, was the fact that the founders of the United States basically called a formal truce, a formal ceasefire with regard to the religious warfare that had been bedeviling Europe for many decades and centuries. That is to say, Protestant London, so-called, versus Catholic Madrid and Catholic France. What the settlers on the North American mainland did was call a formal truce with regard to religious conflict, but then they opened a new front with regard to race. That is to say, Europeans versus non-Europeans. This at once broadened the base for the settler project. That is to say, they could draw upon those defined as white, who had roots from the Atlantic to the Ural Mountains, and indeed even into the Arab world. If you look at people like Ralph Nader and Marlo Thomas, for example, whose roots are in Lebanon, but are considered to be, quote, white, unquote. This obviously expanded the population base for the settler project, and because many rights were then accorded to these newly minted whites, it obviously helped to ensure that many of them would be beholden to the country that then emerged, the United States of America, whereas those of us who were not defined as white got the short end of the stick, if you like.
And Gerald Horne, as a result of that, during the American Revolution, what was the perception or the attitude of the African slaves in the U.S. to that conflict? You talk about during the colonial times, many slaves preferred to flee to the Spanish colonies or the French colonies rather than to stay in the American colonies of England.
You are correct. The fact of the matter is that Spain had been arming Africans since the 1500s. And indeed, because Spain was arming Africans and then unleashing them on mainland colonies, particularly South Carolina, this put competitive pressure on London to act in a similar fashion. The problem there is that the mainland settlers had embarked on a project and a model of development that was inconsistent with arming Africans. Indeed, their project was involved in enslaving and manacling every African in sight. This deepens the schism between the colonies and the metropolis, that is to say London, thereby helping to foment a revolt against British rule in 1776. It's well known that more Africans fought alongside the redcoats than fought with these settlers. And this is understandable because if you think about it for more than a nanosecond, it makes little sense for slaves to fight alongside slave masters so that slave masters could then deepen the persecution of the enslaved and indeed, as happened after 1776, bring more Africans to the mainland, bring more Africans to Cuba, bring more Africans to Brazil for their profit.
We're talking to historian Gerald Horne. He's author of 2 new books. We're talking about the CounterRevolution of 1776. The subtitle of that book is Slave Resistance and the Origins of the United States of America. And his latest book, just out, is called Race to Revolution, the U.S. and Cuba During Slavery and Jim Crow. He's professor of history and African American studies at University of Houston. When we come back, we'll talk about that second book about Cuba. Stay with us.